Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and a warm welcome to our Yara webinar, Autumn Arable Nutrition, Simple Steps to Success. My name is Eva Ross, Marketing and PR Manager for Yara UK and Ireland, and I'm joined by Jon Telfer, Development Manager with Yara Analytical Services in Pocklington, and Natalie Wood, our arable agronomist covering UK and Ireland. So this afternoon, Jon and Natalie are going to take us through what we should be looking at in order to put a successful autumn nutrition plan together for our crops. And they're going to focus on three areas: having a plan in place, being strategic, and being accurate. So Jon will highlight how we can be proactive with the data we gather on grain, crop, and soil. And Natalie is going to discuss P&K management, the optimum application timing, looking at spring versus autumn, followed by the benefits of being accurate with a quality compound. So Jon, I'd like to hand over to you to kick us off for this afternoon, please.
Okay, thank you, Eva, and thank you for inviting me along today. Analysis opportunities to help us optimize our management of crop nutrition definitely exist right across the crop calendar. Those who joined us, hang on, Eva. Yeah, we are working. Those who joined us for our grassland webinar earlier this year will remember we talked about soil health and the best use of organic manure. So we were right at the front end of this crop calendar. Today, I'd like us to have a look at the other end of the calendar, with our main focus being on grain analysis, but also with a quick look back at what happened with the leaf tissue samples we saw earlier this spring. So a simple question: why grain nutrient analysis? Well, it's certainly not something new. We've been using grain analysis to assess the success or otherwise of our nitrogen strategies for some time now. More recently, we've used analysis of nitrogen-sulfur ratios to monitor our sulfur management. But looking at protein first, if we go to RB209, we will find target protein figures for feed and bread-making wheat that correspond to 1.9% nitrogen and 2.1% nitrogen, respectively. Remember those figures, as we'll maybe come back to those again later on. And if we want variety-specific optimum protein targets, we can always refer to the recommended lists. Moving on to sulfur, again, looking at RB209, we can find advice on assessing the risk of sulfur deficiency based upon soil type and rainfall. But how many of you have read further and taken notice of the advice to use tissue and grain analysis as well? And here we should really take note of the nitrogen-sulfur ratio in the grain, with any ratio above 17:1 being an indication of deficiency, with an optimum being somewhere between 14 and 17:1. But the new kid on the block is grain phosphorus testing. And you will now find brand new advice on this within the most recent edition of RB209. And in there it says, grain P&K analysis can provide better estimates of crop offtakes than RB209 values. Very important if we are to avoid mining soils of valuable nutrition. We shouldn't be, farming today's yields on tomorrow's nutrition. And also in there it says AHDB funded research has shown a critical level of 0.32% phosphorus in winter wheat grain. So that means that any grain P results below this level are showing that the crop phosphorus was deficient enough to actually reduce yield. So that's great. For a nutrient that is notoriously difficult to pin down using soil analysis alone, we've now got a new tool at our disposal. But can we do more with this grain nutrient analysis than just look at nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus? Well, the great thing about the modern instrumentation we use in the laboratory is that we can collect data on a whole host of nutrients. In fact, this is something we've been doing at our laboratory in Pocklington for many, many years on the thousands upon thousands of grain samples we have processed. But what can we do with all those results? Well, evidence of reliable and relevant critical values for those other nutrients is scant. But where they exist, it generally indicates that nutrient levels in the grain always follow a similar pattern, with low levels indicating a potential restriction of yield. So if we turn that on its head, we're seeing a more is better rule starting to appear to apply. So how can we interpret data where we have no reliable guides? Well, as we have done very successfully to produce growth stage specific leaf tissue critical guidelines, we can use the many thousands upon thousands of results of our long-term analysis dataset. So to simplify very quickly and briefly a little about what we do, we look at the expected range of analyses results for each nutrient. And we find that most results are somewhere in the middle, with a few results at each end of the range. Some are going to be very low, some will be very high. We then apply a mathematically determined set of interpretation scales within that expected range, from very low all the way through to very high. And by doing that, we can deduce, or can we deduce, that the most common result, somewhere in the middle of that range, represents the performance of an average UK wheat crop at average yield. And will that produce some sensible guidelines for us to work with? Well, when we apply this approach to our long-term grain nitrogen data set, we can calculate that the normal interpretation using this mathematical model triggers at 1.9% nitrogen, and the high interpretation at 2.1%. So exactly the same targets, remember, for protein management that I mentioned in RB209. And that's great. It means we're getting our nitrogen management correct a fair chunk of the time. For soil phosphorus, it produces a guide of 0.32%. Again, the same as mentioned in the latest edition of RB209. And the system produces an optimum guide for nitrogen to sulfur ratio as well. So if it works for those nutrients where we have established, robust, accepted guides, it seems reasonable to extend that system to all the other nutrients that we can analyze for as well. For example, we can apply the same approach to the distribution of grain copper content that we see here. So at Yara, we've produced a grain nutrient report that benchmarks levels of 12 crop nutrients. There's also an offtake summary, which can be used to calculate nutrient use efficiency, and also to ensure we're not mining soils of nutrients and that we are actually replacing nutrition where required. And this is available now for cereals, for oilseed, and for peas and beans. And so far this year, we've received now almost 2,000 samples, and they're still coming in. So that gives us a really solid picture of what is happening this season. And I thought you might like to have a quick look at some of the things we're picking up so far. So starting with the new kid on the block, grain phosphorus, we can see that most results are falling on the marginal to the undoubtedly deficient side of the distribution. Not too much of a surprise, as we saw a real crash in plant phosphorus levels in the leaf samples tested earlier in the spring, as wheat crops moved out of the tillering stage and growth accelerated, and they really kicked on. And we can see that by looking at those pale green bars start to pop up on the left-hand side of the chart. And remember, these interpretations here are produced from our own unique growth stage specific guideline set. And of course, this reflects the horrendous conditions we face. The wettest February on record, when cold, saturated soils will have seen phosphorus availability plummet, followed by the sunniest spring we've ever had, which left reduced root systems struggling to access nutrition in baked hard soils. Moving on, looking at sulfur, we have what I think is actually good news. Both the grain and the spring leaf tissue results show our sulfur management being pretty much on the money. And data like this, together with findings of the British Survey of Fertiliser Practice, I think, show that industry advice is being increasingly followed, and that the suggested application rates are appropriate. And then if we look at some other key micronutrients for winter wheat, and here we've got copper, manganese, and zinc, with grain results at the top and the spring leaf results at the bottom, again, we're seeing plenty of evidence that we're seeing high numbers of suboptimal nutrition in the grain samples, all those amber and yellow bars at the top. So this grain has less nutrient content than our long-term data set would suggest they would normally have. And this corresponds with the spring leaf samples at the bottom, where we can see increases in the rate of deficiency, again, as these crops have progressed. And here again, as I say, we're looking for those light green bars popping up on the left-hand side of the chart. A quick look at key nutrients for oilseed. We've got calcium, boron, magnesium, manganese, and molybdenum. And again, plenty of red, amber, and yellow appearing, particularly for boron and calcium, where levels are far below what we'd normally see. Boron very easily leached at the beginning of the year, and calcium uptake impacted upon by the very dry conditions that followed. And certainly a couple of instances for us to have a closer look at in due course. So what can we draw from this? Well, both the leaf tissue and the grain results for 2020 show a distinct shift below the long-term normal levels. And we're starting to see that we can use management of the active growing crop, this leaf analysis, as an indicator of where nutrient levels in the grain are going to end up. And if nutrient levels in the grain are an indicator of yield or yield potential, then the two are intrinsically linked. And this begs a question to me of where we should be managing these levels. Should we be aiming towards the middle of the distribution to an average level to ensure we avoid deficiencies in normal conditions? Or should we be targeting the right-hand side of the distribution to ensure nutrient sufficiency, even if we hit the most challenging of conditions? And we're already seeing that it's the right-hand side of this distribution that high-performing, high-yielding crops occupy. So if we're going to look to achieve that fine-tuning of our nutrient planning, we need to start now. And we should be asking ourselves a few questions. Questions such as, have we got broad spectrum soil analysis to hand to identify potential deficiencies? Have we considered nutrient seed treatments to a state aid establishment and to get crops off to the very best possible start? Have we addressed seedbed P&K requirements where chronic deficiencies have been identified? Do we target key nutrients in an autumn foliar program to ensure levels are still sufficient as crops re-emerge into a period of vigorous spring growth? But finally, before looking forward, perhaps it's worth checking the nutrient status of that grain in the shed to see if it can provide the springboard for next season's planning. At which point, I think it's probably about time I handed over the reins to Natalie, who is going to share her thoughts on the best strategy to ensure our nutrient planning is a success. Thank you. Over to you, Natalie.
Thanks, John. Really interested. I really like those growth stage specific guidelines. So hopefully people will take those up and we'll start to get some more data on that. So yeah, as John and Eva have mentioned, I'm just going to go through some of the autumn arable nutrition, and I'm going to start with oilseed. Hopefully some people are still growing oilseed out there. I know it's been a horrendous year, but let's not dwell on that. Let's keep going and think into the future. So for those of you that have drilled over the past month or so, hopefully you saw our oilseed establishment webinar and were able to place or broadcast some fertilizer at drilling. However, if you weren't able to, then now is the time to get some fertilizer onto that crop before it's too late. And obviously the cutoff for that is the end of October for fertilizer applications. Now, I've put there wait and see approach is often a self-fulfilling prophecy. Quite often you hear that people are waiting to see whether the crop's going to amount to anything before applying some fertilizer. And this is in itself a risky strategy. If you don't give the crop the best chance of establishing with some fertilizer to start with, then it's unlikely to become the decent crop you're waiting for, and therefore it's potentially going to get written off. Therefore, giving the crop the best shot with some early nutrition is more likely to get that desired result. If you're in an MVZ, then of course there's that limit of 30 kilos of nitrogen per hectare for an autumn application, and as hinted at, then the best form would be an NPK product to give the crop access to P&K before temperatures drop. So yeah, I've mentioned temperatures, and why is that an issue? So once soil temperatures get below a certain level, the phosphate in particular becomes unavailable, and therefore the plants can't access it. As you can see from this graph, the availability soon drops below 20% from 9 degrees in the soil. Once soils are below 5 degrees, then the phosphate is less than 10% available. So getting fertilizer on, whilst the microorganisms in the soil are active, ensures that the plant's going to be able to utilize that fertilizer that you've put down in the autumn whilst the temperatures are still potentially in double figures. If we move on to micronutrients, then of course these are an important factor in oilseed. In the right conditions, oilseed can put on a lot of biomass before winter, and therefore it could potentially run out of some of these micronutrients that it requires in the autumn. Brassitrol Pro, which you've probably heard of, is our crop-specific product specially formulated to contain all the key nutrients required for oilseed. So it's magnesium, manganese, molybdenum, boron, and calcium. And we've carried out lots of trials on Brassitrol Pro since 2015. And this year we actually had a response of 0.66 tonnes per hectare from an application in the autumn and the spring of 2 litres per hectare. And as you can see, it might sound unbelievable, but that gave £217 per hectare extra there compared to the control, which far outweighs the cost of the application. So it's well worth having a look into something like Brassitrol. The long-term average, because of course you're not 0.66 isn't the norm. So the long-term average over those 6 seasons that we've been trialling is 0.33 tonnes per hectare, which is still worth over £100 per hectare from those 2 applications. So again, still well worth having a look at. If we move on to cereals, then thinking about P&K in the autumn, then not all cereals will have that requirement for P&K. Cereals only require a small amount of P&K actually in the autumn. So if you're on index 1 or above, then there should be sufficient in the soil to get the crop up and away through establishment. Of course, if you're on index 0, then an autumn application is recommended, but a smaller amount with the majority of the P&K going on as a spring application. As mentioned before, soil temperatures in the autumn soon start to drop, especially if you're delaying drilling due to grassweed control. In October, November, soils tend to be cold and wet, causing anaerobic conditions which the microorganisms aren't too keen on, and therefore their activity is greatly reduced or stops altogether. As I mentioned, phosphate particularly becomes unavailable in the soil. It becomes fixed with iron or aluminium ions, or precipitated out with calcium over a short space of time. So this means that it becomes an inorganic form that isn't available to the plant. Now you might think that will be accessible in the spring, but that's no way a guarantee. Once the phosphate is in that non-labile form, it's not lost forever, but it takes much longer to reverse that and back from the non-labile to the labile and then into the soil solution where it is plant available once more. And if you look at this chart, you can see there could be up to 2 tonnes of phosphate in the soil. However, only 1 kilo of that is actually in the available form. Another reason for applying P&K in the spring is because that's when the crop demand is highest. It's within that 4 to 8 week period between March and May that the daily demand for P&K rises exponentially, which is shown on this graph here. Therefore, in order to utilise the fertiliser in the most efficient way, apply it when the crop requires it in the spring, and this will mean there's less chance of any being wasted or lost to the environment, and the nutrient use efficiency will also be improved. Another point to notice is that once soil temperatures rise above 5 degrees in the spring, the plant will actually start to grow. However, as we can see from this graph, the P availability is still over 90% unavailable. So therefore, applying an NPKS product such as Activa S or 52S at that first timing at the end of February will give the crop what it requires to kickstart spring growth without relying on the soil temperatures to rise. Autumn micronutrients, again, are equally important in the cereal crop. However, it's often difficult to apply them with the narrow application window due to weather and travelling conditions in the autumn. The Arvita Gramitrol is the crop-specific product for cereals, formulated with the key micronutrients magnesium, manganese, copper, and zinc. Now, there's slightly different advice in terms of when the drill date was. For an early drilled crop, then an application of manganese at the 3-leaf stage as Mantrac Pro to coincide with the insecticide spray will help the establishment, and then follow that up with the crop-specific Gramitrol a couple of weeks later as with the herbicide spray. For late drilled crops, then more often than not, there isn't a chance for a foliar application. Therefore, glycerol MNP seed treatment could be a better option to supply some manganese and phosphate to help that seedling when the conditions aren't favourable. If there's an opportunity to apply gramitrol on the later drilled crops, then of course that would be beneficial to give those late drilled crops the best chance to establish pre-winter. So again, we've run trials on gramitrol over the past 5 years. We've had some really good responses. This year we saw a response of 0.55 tonnes per hectare at one of our sites in North Yorkshire. And if we use November ex-farm prices, that gives us £94 per hectare extra. If we look at the long-term average over those 6 seasons, then we see 0.37 tonnes per hectare, which still gives you £63 extra per hectare, so well worth the application. So to summarise, make sure that you plan your nutrient strategy in advance of the spring to ensure you're prepared and can utilise any data gathered throughout the year to improve on it. Don't buy in haste. Make sure you get the correct product for your strategy rather than what was a good deal at the time but then doesn't meet your needs come the spring. If you're going to the effort of taking samples, spreading accurately, etc., don't undo all that good work by not buying a good quality product or formulation. What we can learn from the wheat yield world record holder is his attention to detail. Everything was planned and tissue results, for example, were acted upon. So if you can improve several things by a small amount, then overall the improvements soon add up. Use an accredited laboratory with the ability to give you accurate, reliable data and the same method of interpretation, so you compare your data year on year. And as I said, the grain analysis and those growth stage specific interpretations are second to none from Yara, so really worth it. Not all micronutrient formulations are equal. Ensure you buy quality products that already include surfactants and humectants, for example, that are required to get those nutrients into the plant efficiently. When thinking of spring P&K, then even accurate spreading is vital to get even coverage of all the nutrients in every landing site. As guaranteed with a compound fertilizer, where each granule or prill contains the analysis that's on the bag. And then finally, plan now for which tools and services you want to use in the spring to help with the nutrient use efficiency, such as the end tester, so that you can get the most out of them. So overall, make sure you plan, have a good nutrient strategy that doesn't leave any gaps, and ensure accuracy in every operation. And I'll hand over back now to Jon to just do a summary of his.
Okay, thank you very much, Natalie. Thank you for coming back for another bite of the cherry with a few reminders. Yeah, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that fine-tuning of crop nutrition can't be achieved by soil analysis alone. Soil testing is crucial, of course it is, to evaluate our current nutrient status and to put together that initial plan of what nutrition, in what form and at what time, but it really needs to be combined with real-time monitoring of nutrient levels via leaf testing to show how that crop is responding to external stresses and to allow us to make any necessary in-season alterations. And then finally, of course, grain and produce testing to assess our successes or lack of successes, as the case may be, our nutrient use efficiency, and also, of course, to reveal opportunities for the future. And by using these tools, we can manage crops to ensure nutrient sufficiency throughout the season, keeping nutrient levels just to the right-hand side of that distribution. But I think it does require a real change in our thinking, as we've spent years as an industry simply talking about avoiding deficiencies, and responding where they are seen. But I think this reactive approach, rather than being proactive, is incorrect. And it leaves us prone to being caught out, certainly, with the kind of year and conditions we've had this year. And it's certainly not an approach to nutrition that we embrace elsewhere. It would be a pretty poor parent who only put fresh oranges on the table when the children begin to show the first signs of scurvy. So why on earth do we think it's okay to manage our crop nutrition in just the same way? So I think I'll finish there and say thank you to both Eva and Natalie for inviting me along today. But most of all, thank you to you for joining us on this webinar. Thank you. And now I'll hand back to Eva, who's going to wrap up and tell us the all-important information on how we can get some basis points. Thanks, Eva.
Great, thanks, John. I like the analogy there of the pirates and the vitamin C. So yeah, and thanks also to you, Natalie, for your slides there. So I suppose for myself there, if I was to take away 3, I suppose, highlights from this afternoon, it would be don't wait and see, plan what you want to do, and be proactive rather than reactive. And then be accurate and source that good quality compound fertilizer. And yeah, it reminded me of buying my daughter her uniform during the school holidays. And on the counter of the shop, Benjamin Franklin's quote of "the bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweet taste of low prices forgotten." So yeah, I thought it was a good one when I saw it. And then finally, then Natalie, great figure then from yourself, that £217 worth of an extra yield this year, when the application of the Bracitral Pro went on in the autumn and the spring at 2 litres per hectare. So yeah, some great points, Natalie and John. So thanks very much. We are now going to have our Q&A session. But as you would have seen in the invites and that went out, we have a basis point for attending the webinar today. So I'm going to leave that up during our Q&A session here for you to take it down. But yeah, a couple of questions have come in there. We'll start off, John, I've got to ask you the first question there on the grain analysis. The grain analysis test looks complicated. Does that mean it's expensive?
No. Do we need any more than that? No. Pocklington, all our broad spectrum tests, be they soil, be the leaf, be the grain, are around that £30 mark per sample. So today's price is, I think that's not even a fifth, it's maybe not even a sixth, a quarter of a ton of grain. And if we can't find opportunities across the analysis of 12 nutrients to find that yield across a field, then I'll be amazed. So especially bearing in mind what we've just heard from Natalie of some of the significant yield responses that she is finding in her trials when fine tuning of nutrition is achieved. So I think 30 quid across a field, 12 nutrients, it's not a big ask, but the potential things you'll discover from that and the discussions you'll have on that are almost endless.
That's great, John. We had another question relating to that as well and the cost. So thanks very much for addressing those, John. And then a question, and I'm going to stick with you, John. A question on the malate test. I understand the malate test is best for nitrogen sulfur ratio. Is this correct?
Yeah, the malate sulfur test has been tried and tested for some time now for assessment of oilseed rape sulfur requirement. Works really well. Great, reliable tool. Leaf testing of this kind can be extended to all nutrients, all plant nutrients. We're looking at 12 nutrients simultaneously, and of course to other crops as well. So both useful tools in their own right. If you've had success using the malate sulfur test, please continue to use it. But looking at in-season testing, which we can now calibrate to particular growth stages across wheat, across barley, across oilseed rape, and so on, is certainly another tool in the box. And I think extends the tool because we're now suddenly looking at complete nutrient portfolio rather than just sulfur.
That's great, John. And I should have mentioned, if anyone would like to ask a question, we have a couple more in here, but if anybody's wondering how to ask a question, just scroll down your screen there and you'll see the area where you can send us a question. Natalie, I have a question here on TSP. If you have high pH soils, is it best to apply TSP in the autumn or the spring?
Okay. So if you've got high pH soils, then you've got high calcium, so therefore the phosphate will precipitate out and become unavailable if you apply it in the autumn. And of course, there's also that temperature aspect that I mentioned of the soil as well. So therefore, spring would definitely be a better option, unless obviously you're on index 0, where you'll have to put something on in the autumn. And it makes sense if you're then to apply the phosphate with the nitrogen. that first dressing, ideally as an NPKS. You can use straights, but it doesn't really give you any difference in terms of costs, because each pass is costing £10 to £15 anyway. So versus the cost of an NPKS, it about balances out.
Thanks, Natalie. And last question there, Natalie. Will the micronutrients only give me a good return on high yield potential crops?
Okay, so if a plant's deficient, then no matter its potential, you're going to be losing yield by having an ineffective system if you've got a deficiency. If we think of Liebig's barrel and the law of the minimum, if anything is lacking, then you're stopping that crop's potential. If we think of a poor crop in particular, then if anything, you need to give that all the help it can get to increase its yield, so don't limit it by letting it have a nutrient deficiency. The trials that we carry out year on year, they're not on sites that we choose, so therefore we've had a variety of good and bad yields, but that 0.3 response is consistent and gives that same amount of money added onto your crop, no matter what the yield is. So if it's a good yield or a bad yield, you're still getting that 0.3 response, which equals the same amount of money.
That's super. Thanks, Natalie. And yeah, that is all the questions we have in now for this. So yeah, I'd just like to wrap it up at this stage. So yeah, that is all from us for this session, and we'll look forward to presenting again in the near future. So take care, everyone, and many thanks again to Natalie and Jon.